Hello, welcome back to Write with Intent. I'm Mindee Arnett, science fiction and fantasy author, bringing you all the tips, tricks, and tools of the trade that I've learned on my publishing journey to help you with yours. Today, I'm so excited. We're going to be going over my very favorite tool that I could possibly be giving you, ways to not make your scenes suck. So, let's get started. Have you ever read a boring story? I have. Do you know that feeling I'm talking about where, you pick up the book, it might have a beautiful cover and has a really cool premise and you're super excited about it, but as soon as you get into the chapters and kind of the nitty-gritty of the story, you find yourself skimming or putting the book down or finding reasons to not pick it up again, so on and so forth. I'm assuming that that's a fairly common thing for most people, and I think that it's an issue that starts very often with the writing itself and the writing on the page. And if you're like me, I think sometimes when you're writing a book, you worry that what you're writing is going to have that same effect when you're done. At least that's something that I struggle with and I worry about. I see it sometimes when I'm reading other manuscripts for other people, just places where the story seems to drag. A lot of times people will talk about this as being the soggy middle. And there are lots of posts out there and advice about how to avoid the soggy middle. Well, this is more or less my suggestion on how to avoid your story getting boring. And it's also some tools that will help you decide what scenes to write and why to write them, which again, as we've talked about before in this vlog, writing is all about making decisions and making meaningful, intentful decisions. So today, the content I'm going to talk about primarily comes from a book called Story by Robert Mckee. Once again, it is a screenwriting book. However, it is phenomenal. Some parts of it aren't very particular to writing novels, but regardless, it is worth an entire read. I actually own multiple versions of it. I have it on audio. I have it on ebook. I have all kinds of highlighted notes on it. And it was one of the tools that I came across not early on, but midway through my career as it exists so far, that had a major impact. It was very, very meaningful to me to read this book and to take away some things on it. So I'm going to rely a lot on some things that he talks about, but while it is more specific in his book to film writing, I'm going to talk more specifically about the novel and then, how you can use these ideas in writing your novel. And so the thing he talks about a lot is something called the story event. So story events, by Robert Kee's definition, event is anything that an event just means change. So he gives an example about how if you go to sleep and the sun is shining and you wake up and it's raining outside, you've had a change. So that's a change, right? But it's not very meaningful. It's not very important. So he talks more about how to create meaningful changes. And his definition of story event is a story event creates meaningful change in the life situation of a character that is expressed or experienced in terms of value. So instead of the word value, I like to use the word charge, and we'll get to that in a second. So let me read that again. Let's kind of unpack it. So basically, a story event creates let's add a caveat. A story event in a good story or a non-boring story creates meaningful change in the life situation of a character that is expressed and experienced in terms of value, or in my words that I prefer because it's a little bit easier to keep in mind, is in terms of a charge. So a story value, by his definition, are the universal qualities of human experience that may shift from positive to negative or vice versa from one moment to the next. Hence my idea of the idea charge. So let me break this down. Well, first, let me give you some examples that he gives of story values. So a story value could be love or hate, truth, lie, loyalty, betrayal, alive, dead, all these things that we as human beings are liable to experience in our own lives, and that we usually are writing about in our characters' lives, because our characters are normally based on human beings, although not always, but at a minimum, they're definitely based on human qualities and human traits and experiences. All right, let's unpack this a little bit and put it in some friendlier terms, because it's kind of high and lofty, and I know I share the definitions across the screen, and hopefully you're able to maybe pause, take a screenshot, write it down, or better yet, go out and get the book and read it. But let me see if I can not only break it down for you in easier terms, but also kind of show you how I I use these tools in my writing, because I don't necessarily think I use them the way Robert Mckee describes, and I don't necessarily think that you'll use them the way I do, but I do think that these are useful tools to have. So basically, the reason why, in my experience or my insight or opinion, however you want to phrase that, the reason why stories get boring is because nothing is actually happening. At least that's usually the case for me. Nothing meaningful is happening. It's like watching, tires spin, and they're spinning and they're spinning, and we're not actually moving forward. We're not having what I call legs in the story. It's just kind of sitting there.
Come to Lena!
And usually a lot of times when I see this happening in a story, it's because the writer has fallen into the trap of needing to pass information over to the reader. The character is exploring something, they're learning something new. And while that information may be interesting, it's not meaningful in terms of the impact it's having on the character's life. So to give you an example, of how to use this as a structural tool to write your stories and also how to use it as a way to determine what scene to write next and whether or not the scene you're writing should even be in your novel. Because that is the other thing I often see, especially in earlier manuscripts before they're published. But non-published aspiring writers, when I've done some manuscript critiques for other people, I see this in the spinning the wheels thing. I also see it in just scenes that are there just to be there. Like, they're not bringing anything quality to the story. They're not moving it along. Oftentimes, because I read a lot of fantasy, these scenes will be travel scenes where, the character is going from, the Shire to Mordor, and we have to hear about every little step along the way. And to be honest and be frank, it's just downright boring.
I'm wasted on cross-country. We dwarves are natural sprinters. Very dangerous over short distances.
It's not only is it boring to read about, it's probably boring to watch in a story or a film. So this tool is a way to decide whether or not the scene you're working on should even be there, or whether or not it's something you could cut completely from your story and still have a novel that makes sense. All right, so let me get down to what I mean in terms of the nitty-gritty of this. So let's say when you start a chapter, you want to think about what the story charge is for your character, whatever character that is the point of view of that chapter. What the story charge is for that character at the start of your chapter or your scene, however you want to break this down. So let's say, for example, I'm going to use an example from the book I'm working on right now. So I have a character whose story charge at the beginning of the story is she is in despair. She basically, life sucks. Everything bad that could possibly go bad has gone bad in her life. She feels trapped in this life situation. She doesn't have any money. She's living in a root cellar, like just classic. Life is bad.
They go to their homes, I go to mine, which happens to be a dump. And when I say a dump, I don't mean like a shabby place. I mean an actual dump where the garbage goes and a bunch of bricks and smashed building parts. That's what I call home.
So that's the story charge at the beginning of this chapter. And that charge is negative. So when we're talking about the value charge, that's what I mean. It has a negative charge. So by the end of the chapter, she has discovered a possible way to change her circumstances, to find some money, to be able to make a difference in all these bad things that have happened. So the chapter ends with that story charge going from a negative to a positive. And the positive, of course, instead of despair, is hope. And so what that does for the reader is that it creates an emotional impact. So rather than if I had started the story with the character in despair and had ended on that same note, it'd be like listening to, a song without a melody. Okay. So rather than having the rise and fall that you would expect in a melody, it would just be striking the same note with me emotionally throughout that whole scene.
Snipe, snipe. Severus Snape.
And a lot of writers, I think, tend to fall victim to this. And so what you want to think about is, if you want to make sure that whatever charge you go into your story with, that charge needs to have changed by the end of your scene or your chapter, I prefer to do it by scene. Sometimes if I have a scene break within a chapter, it means that it's a little bit, there will always hopefully be, at least I intend for there always to be a value change. So a charge change from negative to positive or positive to negative. And a lot of times between the scenes, it's a little bit smaller of a range of change. So rather than going from I love you to I hate you, it's going from I love you to I'm not so sure. And then in the next scene, we get all the way to I hate you, depending on what's happened. So what I find about this that's usually very helpful is that it teaches me to not only avoid the boring parts like I talked about, and you avoid any scene where nothing has happened, where if all I'm doing is passing information to you as the reader, then that scene is a failure. Meaningful changes need to be happening to my character in every scene. Like, you don't have a lot of real estate in a novel, especially if you are a beginning writer. You need every scene and every moment to have a punch. Some people talk about it as having kind of this cymbal clang at the end of the chapter. And I think that for some writers, this comes very naturally, and for some it doesn't. And if it doesn't come naturally for you, this is a way to think about it. To think about, to go back if you've written a scene and see, did your value change in that scene? If it didn't, then you need to rewrite it, or maybe you need to completely 86 it from the story entirely, or just change it up in some way so that every scene has this change. Now, of course, you want to be careful about not making the changes. The changes should not be so dramatic that the reader feels like they're on a roller coaster that's gone off the rails. Like there shouldn't be this head jerk. One moment we're happy and one moment we're sad, and one moment bad things are happening and one moment good things are happening. So keep that in mind in terms of the gradient of your change. But just make sure that there is change. I think it's far more often for writers to get stuck with the same beat than it is for writers to have, huge swings between the story values. Some other things I think about is that the story value change doesn't always have to be positive to negative or negative to positive. Sometimes it can be from negative to an even worse negative. I don't very often go from positive to even more positive, but that's usually because there's lots of bad things happening in my stories. Like there's literally, people being shot at or chased with magic bullets or, dangling off cliffs, metaphorically. But you see what I'm saying. So, there's not a lot of really positive changes. But again, you want to make sure that there's a nice balance between the negative and the positive. Too much negative all the time wears the reader out. A lot of times they just simply actually Robert Mckee talks about this. He calls it the Law of Diminishing Returns, which is not actually what the Law of Diminishing Returns means. But what he's saying is basically if you use the same value change over and over and over again, it starts to lose its impact. Basically, it becomes, we've seen that, been there, done that. So you want to think about these changes, in terms of the whole book itself. Like if you've written the whole book and you're revising, make sure that these changes that it's not always the same change. Like the main character should not be experiencing betrayal at every chapter. There should be moments where they're experiencing loyalty. There should be moments when they're experiencing connection with other people. There should be moments when they're experiencing doubt, or when they're experiencing confidence, when they're experiencing success and failures and all these things. So when when you're looking at the big picture, look at them in those terms. You can even go through, if you're very analytical or like to analyze, you could even go through and mark the changes by each chapter and lay them out on a graph and kind of see, you could give them a value in terms of how big the change is. Like, obviously when we're talking about story structure, which I'm going to get to in a later vlog more particularly, but when we're talking about, a story beat, that's an actual beat. That's the, a reversal or a, the catalyst, or, there's a lot of these terms that I don't want to bore you with right now, and we'll go into them later. Those story value moments should be bigger than the value moments that are being changed within like a middle chapter, like, or in between, when we're going from the catalyst to the 25% mark, when we're talking about, I can't even remember what the name of the story events are. But anyways, when we're talking about, you know, the big beats, you know, the reversals and the things that are happening, or the, you know, the death of the hero, or the moment of death, all those things. So you want to make sure that that you're hitting those beats right, and that you have the right gradient level between them. So I know that this topic probably maybe sort of feels very granular. Maybe you're not ready to think about it in this way. I hope that's not the case. I hope that I did okay explaining it. I'm happy to revisit this and to go into more details. And as a matter of fact, before I sign off, why don't I take a moment and think about an example from a particular scene. So never mind. I realize I already gave you the example from my story. There are plenty of other examples. And because this is a film writing book, he gives examples in the book there. He's actually written them out. You could probably look at films and go and figure out some value changes. So just to throw one out there, I love Guardians of the Galaxy, so I'll talk about that one. Even in the opening scene, not the scene where Peter is a young boy and the mother passes away, which is actually, I would argue there is a value change there, because it starts off sad and then it gets really sad and then it gets scary because he's being abducted. But the actual opening scene where we see him dancing and there's all the music and the fun stuff, and we go from happy, relaxed, good times to, by the end of that scene, he's being chased and running away. So that is a meaningful event, a meaningful value change within the story, to give you an example. Anyway, so I hope you found this helpful. Again, as always, please let me know down below if there are topics you'd like me to talk on. I'm so excited to say that I will be having an archery clinic video coming up in the next couple of weeks. Probably won't be out until May. And I'm not sure when I'm going to post this one, but it's coming and I'm so excited. So if you like to write fantasy and you want to be able to write about kick-ass women on horses shooting arrows, we're actually going to go talk to somebody that does that, and we're going to see it being done and learn some tips about how it actually works, so that when you go to write those scenes, you'll be able to be like, look, I know what I'm saying, and give you that kind of authority. Anyways, so remember, guys, use these tools to help you make meaningful choices. Remember to write with intent and to live with intent, and I will see you next time. Bye.